Hello, everybody, and welcome to it's the fourth in the series of CPD conference videos for your benefit. My name is Dawn Campbell at the IAPC&M, and I'm joined today by Monique Davano, who is a senior accredited coach in the US, French-Canadian, hence the name, and our COO, David Monroe-Jones. Hello, guys.
Hello, Dawn. Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi, Dawn. Hi, Monique.
Hello. So let's start with explaining what is the definition of self in coaching. David, over to you, please.
That is a good question. And the easiest and simplest way to describe it is your ability to be present in the moment and fully engaged with the client. And the emphasis there really sort of like separates into two parts. Firstly, being present. So there's a bit of a conversation to be had, I'm sure, so like as we go through this about, what do we actually mean by being present? There's another part of it, which is what do we mean by in the moment? Because coaching sessions can last anything from a quick laser 5 minutes to a good couple of hours, if not more, longer if it's a team engagement perhaps. And then so like thirdly, what does it mean to be engaged with the client? But the definition that we use for simplicity, so like within the capability model, is the ability to be, when I say the words, the ability to be present in the moment and engage with the client. And then we have a number of indicators that go around that.
Yeah, well, that was making me think that, of course, anybody who's coaching thinks they are engaged with the client. So bearing in mind all of these 12 modules have been put together to help practitioner coaches do even better in the assessment calls that they're going to take in order to gain their accreditation status. How would you even measure those criteria about being engaged, being in the moment, David?
Well, we measure it through a number of different ways, but the main way that we measure it is through the live coaching assessment. And the reason that we do it live, for those people who aren't aware, is that a live coaching session means that we can assess you in the moment, and we can assess whether you're engaging with the client there and then in the moment. So we use that, and a number of the indicators that we would look for would include the coach being able to use their own thoughts, their own feelings, and their reactions, and also so like noticing the reactions of the client to prompt further exploration. And this comes back to things that we've talked about before and things that I'm sure we'll talk about in other future CPD sessions, about not just listening and observing what's spoken, but what's not spoken, what's going on underneath the surface. What is the body language telling you? And that also includes, especially so if you're using audio only, that you might not be able to observe body language, so like visually, but if you really tune your senses in, you can hear so like shifts in body language. Coaches need to be flexible and they need to be responsive to the dynamics of the situation. So that's something else that we look for. I often say that really in coaching, the only question that you can prepare ahead of a coaching session is, well, two questions really. How are you? What would you like to talk about today? The rest of it, like no matter how much reading we all do about powerful questions and structure, is really so like that responsive ability. And again, this comes back to being in the moment. And we also look for the coach responding to the personality of the client. So that might be whether they're so like visual, auditory, kinesthetic, which are predominantly learning styles more than personality. Whether they're more cognitive, whether they're more emotive, or the more action orientated, or the reflective, and all of those sorts of things. And then by the time we get to the more senior level, so senior coach, master coach, fellow coach, we're also starting to ask people to really sort of like think about the language they use, the modalities they use, their pitch and pace, Are they responsive to the client? Do they reflect in the moment, so like in action rather than just sort of like after the event? And also, so you can ask a powerful question. I know we've got a session coming up shortly on powerful questions. But one of the key things, it's great to be able to ask a powerful question, but you need to be able to deal with what comes back as well. So that's all part of it. And it would be remiss for me to not to say, and I hope I'm not preempting or overriding one of your next questions, Dawn, is, what would indicate that somebody wasn't in the moment? And that tends to be things like if a coach is a little bit mechanistic in their interventions, or they don't respond to changes, or they become more self-absorbed and start to give advice, or maybe talk too much about, oh yeah, I've got some experience of that, here's what's happened, rather than letting the client sort of be like explore themselves. And also sort of like later on, as we get to sort of senior up to fellow, if they hesitate, when somebody responds like powerfully to a powerful question and gives you a lot of information, if they hesitate and don't know where to go with it, then that might indicate that they're not present in the moment, or if they miss something and they're not fully engaged with the client.
So an example then, I think, if I understood you correctly, because obviously you're head of accreditation and you train the assessors, is sometimes when I'm listening to a new practitioner, you can almost hear that they're reading a list of questions. So you'd be picking that up intuitively, that they're not in the moment and engaged. Is that a good example maybe?
Yeah, that is a good example. And if I can share a personal example, it's not from coaching, but the principle is exactly the same. Many years ago, when I used to be a trainer, and one of the courses I used to run was recruitment and selection. And part of that, very similar to the assessment process we have, was recording somebody and watching them sort of interview somebody live. And during part of that process, so like during one of those assessments, the person who was interviewing asked a question, because on the application form there was a gap in employment. And the person's response was, yeah, I had some time out because I had an injury at work and I fell off the loading dock and injured my back. And because the person had gone through their application form before and had written out a list of questions, their next response was, oh, and how did you injure your back? And the person just smiled and responded, well, generally, when you hit the concrete, that's what injures your back, because they totally missed the response, because they were so absorbed in, right, I've asked a good question, what's the next good question that I'm going to ask? And the example I often give is that if you look at any quiz program, you get asked a question and you answer it, and then you wait for the next question, and then you answer it. And good coaching is almost the reverse of that. It's what's the response coming back, right? Based on that response, how am I then going to respond? But yeah, you're absolutely right. If it's I'll hold my hands up. And for those of you who can't see me, I'm holding my hands up. And if you can't see me, hands are up. When I started coaching, I had post-it notes, all over. I had books open, and what are the powerful questions to ask? And they are powerful questions, but they're powerful questions when they're appropriate to the situation and what's going on for the client. Otherwise, it's a bit like going to the dentist and saying, look, my dog's got a limp. You're like, what do I need to do? And they're going to respond to, oh, it's a good question, but you've come to the wrong place.
So by the time practitioners come for their live assessment call, which is 30 minutes, and it usually flies by, but it can seem like a long time when you're booking it, have trust in your capability by that stage and leave all your props behind. Get rid of the books and all the post-it notes, because I would guess in an assessment it's going to be pretty distracting.
Yeah, and I used to, before I got used to just saying, look, the coaching session is whatever the client brings, not what I bring. It's very much about, certainly within the practice, so like when you're practicing with like your pro bono coaching, at the outset, you might need the model to hand, you might need some questions, because that's how we learn. But as you say, like, have faith in your ability and just start putting them away and just thinking like, all I'm going to do, I'm just going to listen. And if you want to really practice it, close your eyes and do it, so that you can't see your notes and all you're doing is you're like just listening, eyes closed, no notes, nothing, just sit there, and ask some questions.
I'd like to bring you into the discussion at this stage, Monique. I know you're not part of the accreditation team, but as a sought-after coach and a senior practitioner, you've been through all of this, and you'll have heard from David just talking now. A lot of the 12 modules are kind of interlinked. We've mentioned powerful questions and listening, but what does it mean to you to use yourself in your coaching experience, please?
First, I have to say, if you have trouble hearing me, let me know, because my audio started to give me a little bit of trouble. So can you both hear me okay?
You're coming through nice and clear at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, great. I love the example that David gave about the person falling and hurting his back. The awareness that a coach has to have is critical. Being in the moment, shifting when the client shifts, shifting context when the client shifts context is extremely important. And an example is sometimes when a client is speaking, they make a statement which could be very important for them, but they don't realize it. So they keep speaking and they keep talking and they might change the subject. And if the coach is truly present and in the moment and aware, the coach may catch that statement and then may bring the client back to that, or may say something like, well, a few minutes ago you said this. Can you tell me more about that? Is that relevant? So the coach has to be very much in tune with the client during the conversation, and having a list of canned responses or canned questions won't allow the coach to really be in the moment and shift when that client shifts. The other thing that happens many times with my clients, they come to a session with many things filling their mind. They have many things that they want to address. And of course, you have a limited time frame in coaching in a session. So it's really up to the coach to make sure the client is clear about what should be addressed in that session, what is the priority for the client, and help the client shift through and sift through what the topic of the session will be. Otherwise, the client will be going in all different directions and the coach is trying to keep up with that. So it's things like that that really means the coach has to be extremely flexible and listening, paying attention. The other thing the coach has to do is really manage their own emotions during a coaching call, especially now with things that are happening in our world. Clients are coming to the sessions with a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, and it could be very easy for the coach to become enmeshed in those emotions. And coaches by nature are highly sensitive people. Some are very empathic. We pick up easily on others' emotions. It could be easy for a coach to become absorbed in the client's emotions within the session. But if you are truly present and aware, you're not only aware of what the client is talking about and feeling, but you're also very much aware of what you as the coach are feeling during that session. And if you start to pick up on that client's anxiety and fear, then you are feeding into that. And you're not helping the client at all. You're actually doing quite a disservice to them. So it's very important that the coach knows how to manage their own emotions before the call. And then even after the call, how do you clear your energy before the next call? Because many of us are going from one coaching call right to the next, and we may still carry that energy with us from the previous call. So in order to be very present and aware in the next call, there's something that has to take place between the client so that the coach can recoup and recover before taking on the next client.
Thank you. There was a lot of points in there that I want to come back to, please. And I'll save the clearing the energy right until the end. The first example you gave, I think is very much about intuition. How important is intuition in terms of being present and having self-awareness in coaching?
To me, it's very important. The intuition, having a strong intuition may help a coach formulate the next question once the client says something. Mm-hmm. We may be able to sense something, as David mentioned earlier, that the client really isn't saying, but might be feeling. And that might lead us to a very important open-ended question for the client. Intuition is also important as it relates to the coach. And again, to knowing how we are feeling, knowing if we are becoming enmeshed in that client's story. Listening to our own intuition is important so that we can quickly pivot ourselves and pull ourselves out of that emotional story. So I think it is a critical skill, if you will.
David, what would you add to that in terms of how does a coach develop their intuitive skills?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that some people are naturally gifted. So, like with intuition, it's almost part of their personality. So, if you looked at a Myers-Briggs personality indicator, for example, a type indicator, there are certain traits that people have that are they're just naturally intuitive about things. I think so. Like people who are reasonably spiritual as well, so like who follow that path, so like can pick up on a lot of things. But for those of us who aren't, and I don't necessarily, or certainly didn't class myself as being so like highly intuitive, it was something that I really had to work at. Is first and foremost is trying to let go of the logical mind, because your logical mind might just take you down that, right, here's a powerful question, here's another one, so that you become so like quite task focused. And that ability to let go and just like let things emerge, so that ability to pick up things as they happen, getting onto that that language of in the moment, and just let it let it circulate, let it permeate a little bit, and and then just check it out. Like there's nothing wrong with asking a question, or saying to a client, look, can I just clarify something? I'm getting the sense that, and if they come back and say, yes, that's absolutely correct, then it's a sort of tick box for your intuition. And if they come back and go, no, what I meant was, it's not about beating yourself up and going, my intuition's awful. It's about looking at it and going, okay, so, when I reflect later on, what was it that told me that was happening, when in fact it was something else? So it becomes a learning experience. And I think so. Like the other thing that you can do is check your intuition out outside of outside of work. So when you're at play, when you're relaxing, when you're doing whatever it is, just notice the times that your intuition just goes, oh yeah, I think it's going to be this. So for me, it's watching murder mysteries, and within that, there's sort of like an intuitive part that goes, oh yeah, I think it's going to be that person. I think that person's going to be the murderer, the blackmailer, whatever it is. And just checking out later on whether well, was I right, and what led me to to those conclusions. And I think the other thing as well is that like everything in coaching, when we talk about small steps are still steps, is that as you're developing your intuition, then every small step you take in developing it is making you sort of like a better coach, because your intuition is growing alongside you. But I would, and I appreciate your asking the questions, but I'm going to throw this back to you, because I know your skills and background in this area, and I know that it's one of your specialities. But for the audience, what would you say about being intuitive?
Yeah. Well, again, I think you're right. It's easier or seems to come easier to coaches that are quite spiritual. That's what I've noticed. They seem to listen at a deeper level. They seem to be able to tune in to their inner self, that is able to say, I'm sensing such and such if the client is kinesthetic, or what I'm hearing is, and then getting a response back from the client that says, yes, you're on the right path. We're exploring a trigger, or your intuition is correct. So that's one of the ways that I would be challenging my clients, that my intuition was right about something. And of course, as you said earlier, David, if you do ask that question, you have to be able to deal with what comes out of Pandora's box. And that's why the assessment process that we have in place is so important, because if you're a cookie cutter coach, you know all the great coaching questions, you've got the 50 great coaching questions printed out, but it's how do you put them in the right order? When do you use the appropriate question, and so on? Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about. Sorry, let's talk a little bit about Monique's point about triggers. Monique, perhaps you could just share a couple of examples of flags that clients raise, what it might trigger in a coach, and how do we use our intuition to deal with that? Perhaps you've got an example you can share.
Yes. So I was having a session with a client, and she was having financial issues. So she came to the call highly charged with a lot of anxiety and emotion and things like that. And I had to pay particular attention to my own reactions to that, because there was a time in my past as a single parent when I also was having financial issues. And it immediately triggered me as a coach. So I'm highly intuitive, and I was able to immediately feel what was happening in my body, understand what was happening within me, and was able to disconnect from that trigger so that I could be very present with her, because it was her situation, her story, not mine, and was able to successfully coach her through that by being very objective and not bring my own past into that. So that would be an example of something that triggered something for me from my past as a coach. And had I not been so intuitive, I don't think I would have realized that it was triggering me, and the coaching conversation would have been a lot different, and it probably wouldn't even have been considered a coaching conversation.
Okay, interesting. So intuition plays a massive part of module or criteria 4 then, doesn't it, David? Use in self in coaching. It's intuition.
Oh, yeah, very much so. And I think there's an old expression which is all development begins with self-development. And if you expand that, it's all awareness begins with self-awareness. So part of that skills and personal development for all coaches at all levels is recognizing that the more self-aware we are, and the various profiles and feedback and coaching that we can do ourselves, and supervision that we can undertake, allows us then to say, well, okay, what are the areas of development? So when we look at the capability model, so like in the 4 areas of that, so you've got the underpinning skills and knowledge, the behaviors, the CPD, professional development, so like in reflection, they're all interconnected, so that when we come out of a coaching session and we practice our reflection, part of that might be you know what, you're like, I perhaps need to be a little bit more intuitive with this client. How am I going to develop that? So it all links back around, because if I then go away and learn it and it becomes an underpinning skill that I then use in my behavior, then I'm back around to the reflective piece and asking that question. Well, okay, so I did something different this time. How was that? You're like, how did that work? But yes, you're absolutely right. Intuition, so like, is one of the things that is, and I'm sure, like a psychologist might challenge me on this, but intuition for me, so like, is one of the difficult things to measure, unless you're in the moment with somebody and you can recognize that it's taken place. Because there are, some people who will say, oh, well, you shouldn't listen to gut reaction. But gut reaction is really your body telling you that, look, something's going on that you need to be aware of. And it is whichever part of your body is telling you, saying you might want to explore that a little bit more. Because the thing with intuition, along with a lot of other things, is that once it's gone, it's gone. So once that moment is passed, it's a bit like standing in a river. You never stand in the same body of water twice. Once it's gone, the client by this stage has raised something else, and trying to remember the intuitive part of what happened maybe like a minute ago, which doesn't sound a long period of time, but when, as Monique was saying, the client's bringing a lot of information out, you have to keep up with that. So the other thing around intuition, I guess I would say, is that when intuition strikes, do something with it. Don't park it and ponder on it, because the likelihood is that it'll have gone by that point.
I think that in a way that's why, well, certainly in my instance, I've sort of developed my own shorthand. I mean, all of my coaching pretty much is virtual. So I tend to write my notes, but I don't tend to look down very often. So I've got my own scribbles. And you need to be able to quickly write, a trigger, the client is visual or kinesthetic. So how would I phrase that question in a way that speaks to their type of language and sees that moment with intuition? A trigger, a clue, a flag, a red flag that you need to raise with them. So, you can make notes, but you wouldn't be losing eye contact and writing verbatim everything that they've said and then saying, a few minutes ago you said such and such. You do have to seize the moment. But I would also say, David, that having mentored students for nearly 2 decades in their coaching skills, intuition and the VHF, establishing the whether they're kinesthetic, visual, or auditory, but certainly the intuition is one of the hardest things. And I don't know whether it's because in the moment, in their assessment call, they're not able to listen intuitively at level 3, or whether it's just a really difficult skill to pick up. And I would also add that it's even harder, or it seems to be even harder, among the male coaches that I've looked after over the years. What do you think about that?
I would tend to agree, because there are lots of studies about what women are better at than men, and vice versa. It's probably not so much on the vice versa bit, but there are certain skills and characteristics and traits that that women can do within coaching, in their intuition, that tends to change the graph more so in their favor. I think one of the difficulties with the intuition part is that quite often when you're going through your initial coach training, one of the things that you might be encouraged to do when you're using your intuition or trying to use your intuition is ask a question prephrased with, my intuition is telling me that X, Y, Z. And the problem with that is, it's a great question, but if it's not underpinned by real intuition saying, oh, yeah, my intuition is really telling me this, it just becomes an atypical added question that you've got.
Yeah.
And whereas some schools might say, oh, well, we need to hear that you're using your intuition on a call. My stance on that, and very similar to what you were saying, is based on, look, if intuition's there, it'll come out. if somebody just says, oh, my intuition tells me, all that tells me is they've used the word intuition.
Yeah.
What I'm looking for is, well, what's underpinning that? And that'll be phrased in, in the question. So my intuition, for example, somebody gives a response to a question, and there's just something that tells you, yeah, I don't think they believe that.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, really deep down.
Mm-hmm.
And then I might respond to that. You're like, my intuition tells me that there was something about the way that you responded that you're like might not be, you're like, true to what you really believe. And I'm just curious. You're like, yeah, and then you're like, yeah, wherever it goes based on what they talked about. And then if they suddenly pause and then you're like ponder and go, yeah, you're right, there is something. Then you're like, you've got something there, and it becomes genuine and it becomes congruent between what they're saying, the way they're saying it. And you're absolutely right. Things like tonality, the pace, the pitch, the way they respond. Like it's all about just having that presence of mind to think, right, I'm with the client here. There's a book, and for the life of me, I've forgotten the person's name. I think it's Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline. But he wrote a book on change called The Dance of Change. And within the coactive coaching model, they talk about the dance that you have with the client, that you're both moving together, that there's a fluidity to it. And that's what being in the moment for me is. It's that fluidity. You're both moving together. And as I've stressed to a lot of people, coaching is not something that's done to you. Coaching is something that you're part of. Mm-hmm. So it's that fluid. If you move together and there's a fluidity to it, then you can respond to if it was a dance. And I don't dance. I hasten to stress very, very strongly. But if you watch anything like Come Dancing, Strictly Come Dancing, or anything like that, the difference between the people that are the professionals and the people who aren't is the way that they move together. Like true professionals just have that connectivity. They know everything about the party. Like, so if somebody moves one way, they can counter it. And they move and they seem to float across the dance floor, rather than those people who are a little bit it's more mechanistic. Mm-hmm. And I think if I was going to use a metaphor, then then that's what we're after. And I could take it even further, and just building on Monique's point about the fact that some clients will come with so much, and it becomes almost like a scattergun of information that comes out. It's between maybe a waltz and a tango. There's a different pace to it, but the one thing that holds everything together is that both dance partners are moving together. They're just moving at the same pace. And that's another. I think that's another thing. So your intuition picks up as well, because if your preferred style is quite laid back, quite mellow, just taking it nice and easy, but your client is a little bit more fast paced, logical. They want answers, and there's a quicker pace. One of you is going to need to adapt, and that adaptation again is being in the moment, being present, and this is when we start to lean towards really being engaged with the client. And in martial arts, they used to say that when you were sparring, what you were trying to do, when you faced off against your partner, and they do this quite a lot, in Tai Chi, in moving palms, when you're working with a partner, is get your breathing to the same breathing as your partner. And then when they start to move, you'll sense that automatically. You'll sense the change in pressure, the change in dynamic. They might breathe in a little bit more deeply, and then as they move, you just go with it. And there's a that sort of yin and yang, flow to it. It's probably a little bit more than what you want.
I love the dancing analogy. Yeah, it's very good. Thank you. I love the dancing analogy. And just going back to that intuition point, particularly with practitioners, and they're about to take their assessment, and they're used to saying, my intuition tells me, because they know it's on that list and they want to get that question out. Of course, if they've got the intuition wrong, what does that do to rapport? And as we talked in CPD video number 2, trust is really important as part of the rapport. So if you've asked that and you've got it wrong, your client's going to think you're not on the same page as me, you're not listening, you don't get it. So
yeah, I think I think the one thing I would just add to that as a little bit of a challenge is, I think if you get it wrong once and you can professionally manage it,
mm-hmm.
you know, you're all right. So in an assessment, if somebody said something and I said, no, it's more about this,
mm-hmm.
that wouldn't concern me too much. I would comment on it in the feedback afterwards.
Yeah.
But if they keep doing it,
mm-hmm.
and it's, oh yeah, my intuition tells me, for me personally, that would irritate me. And I've worked with some, so like for my own supervision, some really senior coaches, and hand on heart, I can tell you, without exception, none of them have ever said, have used the words my intuition. They skip that bit and they just go straight to the core of I'm sensing.
Yes.
And in some cases, cutting straight through and go, yeah, that sounded great, but you don't believe it, do you? It's like, you're like, well, now you mention it, no. So there is that element of believing in yourself. Something that you said earlier on about that, the trust, not just the trust element, but you're like trusting yourself that you know what, you're like, I can do this. And you can't escape the fact that a lot of people come to the assessments and at the back of their mind is the word assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say to people, look, all we want to know is, can you coach? Yeah. So you're like, don't worry about it. Coach as best you can in the same way that you would coach one of your clients. And that's it.
So if we accept that my intuition tells me is a cookie cutter question and we don't want to ask it. So we've got, I'm sensing that, or what I'm hearing is, if they're auditory. Monique, what other questions would you throw in there that is really saying to the client, I'm engaging with you, I'm using my intuition here, I'm hearing you?
I would ask them a question such as, can you say more about that?
Mm-hmm.
Get them to expand a little bit more on something that my intuition is telling me could be important to them, and really focus them on expanding and explaining more about that.
What if they say no?
Well, if the session is about the client,
mm-hmm.
and even though my intuition and my sensing is telling me something that I feel they should explore more of, if they choose not to, I don't believe a coach should continue to push that. Others may have their own style or their own opinion about that, but sometimes I notice in a conversation, if a client doesn't want to address something and then we continue on with the conversation, there may be times when later in the conversation, the client will come back around at some point and end up still addressing it. So maybe not in that moment where I've asked that question, but maybe a little further down into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So my approach is to allow them to shift in the way they need to, and then possibly it'll come back up later, or maybe even in a later coaching conversation,
mm-hmm.
once they're perhaps ready to handle it, or maybe once there's less resistance that they have.
And again, that is talking to the fact that coaches need to be flexible, and remember, it's the client's agenda.
Exactly. That's very, very important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think something else I'd like to bring up at this stage is we've talked about pitch, pace, and tonality. And I'd just like to throw in there praise as well, in terms of being engaged. Again, as a mentor for student coaches, what I often hear is that their tonality and their praise is not congruent with maybe the topic or the client's energy. So somebody might be saying, take your example, David. They're so in the zone of their agenda and their questions. Oh, I fell off such and such and hurt my back. And they go, fantastic. So what did you do next? It's like, really? Is that fantastic? It's just so inappropriate, the type of praise and filler words that they use. That's one way of catching them out, isn't it?
Yeah, and just a similar example. Again, so like back in the days when I was training, a different person, but again, you had some time off. Yes, it was for bereavement. Like my partner died. Oh, that's great. Thanks for that's great. And then moving on, and not recognizing that oh, that's great. You're like, cheers. Yeah. That's the way that they should should have responded. And you're absolutely right. There's a thing about, if a client talks about something that they've done, and let's accept the fact that internally we might think, well, that's not really much. Actually, but for the client, it might have been absolutely massive. And this part, and it goes back to what Monique was saying about recognizing what's going on for me, and that the whole process of engaging with the client before you have that call is taking some time and going, you know what, I just need to get rid of anything that's going on. Whatever the client brings is okay. Full stop, end of story. Good, bad, indifferent, that's not the point. It's all about the client. It's not about me. It's not about how I coach. It's not about anything else. What are they going to get out of this session? How can I best serve them? So if a client says, I've done this, and I haven't managed to do as much as I said I would do, but I've done this. Great. It doesn't matter that you didn't do as much as you said. We can talk about that in a minute. But you've done more than you had, so you've moved. And you should congratulate yourself about that. Mm-hmm. I suppose the only caveat is that certain personality styles don't celebrate, and as you know well, so I generally don't celebrate success. It'll be I've done that, and move on. Other people, will want to do something. It'll want to be a little bit more dramatic. But you're right. There needs to be that congruence. So that if you say, "Oh, great," you're well done. It sounds like it's, "Oh, great, well done," not, "Oh, great, well done." Subtext: what? Really? That? What? Just that? Mm-hmm. Because clients are not daft. Clients will pick up on things like that, and more and more, especially in the situation we're in at the minute, because we talked about this on a different call. So when we were having our sort of global get together, weekly global get together, about we all have a shared experience now. So we remain the same, but we have the shared experience of what's going on in the world, and the only thing that's changed is the situation. So we're using technology more. Things are more virtual, which means that people are becoming more in tune with picking up what's being said, because they have to concentrate a little bit more. Nobody's walking in and out of an office, or you're not standing at the water cooler or the coffee machine. You're sort of staring at a screen, and and accepting the fact that you might have dogs and things running around and kids running in and out because people are home working. You're still a lot more focused on on what's going on, and you pick up on these little nuances. So I think that you have to be it's not a word that we use within the description about self-in coaching, but the word I would use, you have to be genuine. So you have to be congruent, you have to be genuine, you have to be transparent, because if a coach challenges you back, and some will, around, well, you're saying it's good, but I don't think it is. This goes back to Monique's point and your earlier point, Dawn, about, okay, now that that's out in the open, you need to deal with that. Mm-hmm. You can't just brush it off and go, well, okay, well, we'll park that for a later date. Mm. If it's important to the client, then it's important to have a conversation about it.
And of course, if they say, well, that isn't noteworthy, again, it damages the rapport, that or potentially could damage the rapport, that you're just not on the same wavelength. And I would also add, David, that although some people don't celebrate, or they don't celebrate in the same way, cultures don't as well. So I've tended to be a mentor for what I'd call the old Eastern Bloc countries: Romania, Poland, Hungary. And I can tell you, unless it's very genuine, tailored, meaningful praise, they don't like it. They will not accept, "Oh, well done," and another coaching question. It has to be very specific, and it has to be the sort of praise that builds on an idea or whatever they just did or whatever they said to help them move forward, because they're not from cultures of praise. I mean, they've said to me many times, you know, you have to win the Nobel Peace Prize to get praise in their family or in their culture. So that's worth noting as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think the additional bit that I would add to that is, you know, this goes back to the, when we talk about all of these sort of CPD calls being linked, it goes back to that contracting and using that contract, you know, not just to, you know, like sort out the, you know, what do you want to gain from the coaching, the number of sessions and everything else. But that is the time that you get the sense of, right, you know, what am I learning about this client, the way they speak, their tone, what they're looking for, you know, how am I going to engage with them? And, you know, and this is where you're absolutely right. You know, like just knowing a little bit about, you know, the cultural aspects, not being frightened to ask them questions about, well, look, you know, do you want praise? Do you want to be challenged? You know, what sort of, you know, like coaching, you know, like is going to work best for you? You know, what have you had before? What worked? You know, what didn't work? And, you know, and just throwing out the, you know, the classics are like, you know, I invite you to always challenge me as your coach, you know, in order that I can get the best from you. So if I'm not delivering the service that you want, you know, we have a dual responsibility. You're like, your responsibility is to tell me, and my responsibility is to do something about it.
It's that
and if
honesty,
we can, great. Yeah, absolutely. And all of this, you know, like, if we didn't have so like the 12, so like the 12 characteristics, the 12 capabilities in linear form, they would all almost form so like a mosaic, that everything is interconnected with everything else. You can't do one without the other. So if one falls over, there's going to be something. And I'm sure, so like from your vast experience, so like of the assessments and the mentoring, it's very rare that somebody scores, you know, like a low mark in one area and they haven't scored an equally low mark somewhere else, because there's, you know, like,
they're interlinked.
you can't have that without doing that.
Exactly. Well, before we wrap up, Monique, I would like to hear more, and I'm sure our listeners would. How do you protect your energy and your space in between your client calls so that you are fully present and engaged for each new client, particularly for those coaches who are busy and have back-to-back clients?
Thanks for bringing that up. I was hoping you would. What I try to do personally, if I try to block space between each call, if I can, and then during that time, I walk away from my computer. I walk out of my office, away from my desk. I look outside. I take some deep breathing. If I have time, I'll do a few minutes of meditation just to kind of recenter, get some water, things like that. If I don't have time, if it's a back-to-back call, I try to do some quick deep breathing. For me, it's the quickest thing I can think of that I can do while I'm still there at my desk in front of the computer. It's just close my eyes and take a minute or two of some deep breathing. I put the client's file away so that I'm not still looking over those notes. And I just try to recenter that way very quickly. In the general sense, I do a lot of meditating. I do a lot of personal work, personal development work, to try to learn and remember how to recenter quickly. And that involves all kinds of things, a lot of self-compassion work, reading, personal development reading, things like that, studying Buddhist practices, just so that in a general sense, I can continue learning. And that helps me also then when I'm very much in the moment and have to shift very quickly between clients.
Excellent. Well, there's not very much I can add to that. You're obviously my spiritual sister, because it's very, very similar. On the occasions where I accidentally don't give myself enough time, then all I can do is some deep breathing. And that exhalation is much longer to just really clear and center any previous engagement that I've had. The other thing is a clean sheet. I'm a little bit OCD about my space. I like it all very pristine. I can't really think with clutter. And then having a clean sheet of paper means there's a clean story, a new story about to be unveiled. What about you, David? What would you do to sort of really make sure that, you know, the previous call is behind you and you're totally in the moment, engaged for this next client?
I always make sure that there's enough space, so like in between clients. So at least a minimum of 15 minutes, ideally, so like 30, because sometimes, and Monique brought this up about, you know, the things that sort of like a client can bring up in yourself. So if there's been any transference or counter transference, or if something's come up that I haven't been comfortable about in the way that I've dealt it for my own reflection, or I want to make a note of something because I want to talk it through at some point with the supervisor, then that 15 to 30 minutes, so it gives me enough time to disengage and deal with that. Then I'll usually just, you know, I might go like downstairs, you know, my office is upstairs, go downstairs, maybe have a walk around the garden. And then I'll come back and then I'll start to think about, right, how am I going to move into the next session? You know, where am I with this client? You know, what have we done so far? How am I feeling? What's going on for me? There's what used to be called, so like the presenter's highway code, which was based on this sort of like stop, look, listen approach of crossing the road. And I tend to adopt that, which is very much the, you know, like stop, right, you know, what's going on for me? Are there any distractions? So for example, you know, somebody decided to build a wall, you know, like further down the street, you're like, are the dogs barking, or, you know, anything else? Is it too warm? Which is unusual for red car, but it does happen. So the stop, you're like, look, right, you're like, is there anything that's out of place? You're like, have I got pen, you know, a pen to hand? You know, have I got my sort of like notepad? You know, like, just listen, you're like, and just have that general, right, you're like, how am I feeling? Am I okay to start this? And then at the time that the session is due to start, is that, right, you know, here we go, you're like, be punctual, you know, it's due to start at this time, so, you know, I'm ready, you're like, yeah, let's engage. And then the sort of engage, disengage, so like at either end, for me, because I'm sort of like quite cognitive, quite logical. So I do a lot of sort of like thinking afterwards around, right, what went well, what didn't go so well. And I do tend to run through in my own head the sort of like, you know, what could I start doing, stop doing, continue doing, do more of, do less of, as part of sort of like the reflection. And also the, like, you know, did I miss anything? But I think so like certainly within a number of the supervision models, there's a reference always to, you know, that make sure that you give yourself time before a coaching session and after a coaching session, so that you are ready for the client when you begin, and you can reflect on what you did with the client when you finish. Yeah, as well as then saying, okay, right, you know, then there's a gap. Then, you know, we repeat the process for moving on to the next one. Because the other thing I would add, and we haven't got time to discuss it, but it's worthy of consideration, is asking the question, you know, is there a difference between, you know, so let's say you've got 3 or 4 clients in a row, and a number of them are on life coaching issues, but a couple of them on commercial and business issues, you know, and how you need to make that switch between, you know, working so like at a very personal level, and then maybe switching, you know, like into, right, this is going to be very corporate, it's about culture, it's about leadership, it's about developing executive capability. Yeah, you still need to be in the moment and present and engaged, but you might be doing it a different way. And if, as you say, if you don't have that gap to make that sort of like switch and be ready, then you might carry something across that's inappropriate in some ways.
And I guess you have to have carried something over that's perhaps inappropriate to even be able to reflect and say, I could do better next time. So it could be that you've got a couple of life coaching scenarios, and then a business one, you've not left enough time to get into a corporate state, which for me, it would be, I would tend to stand up. I would tend to dress differently for those particular clients. I want to feel much more punchy and dynamic. and less relaxed, and I'm a bit more on my toes maybe. So if you haven't allowed that time, you can think, oh, I could have done better. But that's where the reflection comes in. You know, we're constantly trying to be better coach for our next client each and every day. You never sit back, you never get complacent, just think, yeah, job done. I'm brilliant. I'm a good coach. You're constantly evaluating how you did, what you could have done better, which is why your CP journal is so important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more.
So just to finish up then, top tips. I'll kick off. I think I really only have one extra thing to add to what we've discussed today, and that is to become a really well-rounded, well-read practitioner. You do not have to know everything about everything. You just have to have a little bit of knowledge about as many subjects as possible, so you can point the client in the right direction, or you can learn more about a particular subject. But I think being really well read on a lot of topics will stand you in good stead. So that's my top tip. Monique, what would you add to that, please?
I think back to the topic about praise. What I would suggest for coaches is that whether it's called praise or acknowledgement or whatever word you use, if you put yourself too much in the place of a parent to your client and say something like, oh, I'm very proud of you for doing that. I'm so happy that you did that. It's a form of praise, but it's a form that's probably not appropriate for coaching. It's not really acknowledging the client, rather than to say, that was so courageous of you to do that. So there's a difference in the wording when you're truly praising and acknowledging a client, and I would suggest that coaches try to be careful of that distinction.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I'm a bit of a stickler for that. When I'm mentoring students, when they say, I'm proud of you, you can say something instead like, you must be so proud, if you think they are, if you're sensing that they are, or, you know, how do you feel about that? If they're kinesthetic, but really minimize using the I and the me. So at the end, you don't have to say things like, oh, I hope you had a good session, or I'm really pleased with how today went. You know, faint praise is no praise at all. You really have to put it in the you and what's in it for them type of language. I totally agree with you on that, Monique. That's an important point. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
David, last top tips and thoughts, if you have any, please.
I totally agree with you, Dawn. I totally agree with Monique as well. I don't really have much to add, except just going back to the title, which is use of self in coaching. It's about be yourself. Don't try and be something that you're not. If you have a certain style, if you have a certain way, and if that style in that way works, then that's what you develop, so that you become the coach that you can be. And there is an expression in one of the supervision books that I've been reading recently, which is, and I'm paraphrasing, the way that we supervise is really all about who we are. So when you think about being a coach, you can sort of transplant that into the way that I coach is a reflection of the person that I am. And that if you can engage, then that is all that you can ask. You engage with the clients and everything else. One of the things that's that if people want to try and exercise about what it really means to be present in the moment and engage, step outside of the the coaching arena. Just think about your life and think, right, what times in my life have I that I can recall have I really been in the moment and really engaged with somebody, and that might be the day that you got married. It might be some sort of other party, or the first time that you met your partner, you're like anything like that, the first time you picked up a puppy, anything like that you can recall and go, you know what, you're like, at that moment in time, I was just so in the moment. You're like, I was just so engaged with what was going on. And if you have an example of that, then there is nothing stopping you being in a similar position with a client, because it's something that you can clearly do. It feels alien because the client, you don't have that same closeness, but you do have the ability to engage, and be in that moment. And it's about, as you say, reflection, focusing, learn, practice, review, do, conclude, repeat.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we've said with all the calls, and we'll continue to say with the remaining calls, these are for you, the practitioners. We hope we've been engaged and present and really in the moment, and you've picked up lots of tips, but please do tell us what you think, and send us your questions and we'll answer them in future calls. So we'll end it today for now. So thank you, Monique. Enjoy the rest of your day, because I know it's quite early in the morning for you. And thank you for your input as always, David. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Monique. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.